Did you know that the first shots of the Civil War, fired during the attack on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, involved cadets from our very own Citadel? Or that Lee, not Grant, was initially offered the job to command the Union Army against the Confederacy but declined? Or that Grant was a slave owner until 1857? Hello everyone, my name is Brad Mock, and today I would like to spend some time with you comparing Ulysses S. Grant to Robert E. Lee. As you will see, their different leadership approaches and communication styles were learned and developed early in their lives, making them reflections of their upbringing as the two prominent and opposing military leaders of the Civil War. One of the most important chapters in our nation's history was written during the Civil War by Generals Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee. The Civil War took place from 1861 to 1865 and saw Grant fighting for the Union Army while Lee fought for the Confederacy. Both are considered among the best military leaders of their time, and this presentation will explore their similarities and differences by examining the following: their backgrounds, visions and goals, leadership approaches and communication styles, military effectiveness, and finally, their post-war contributions. The actions of both Lee and Grant during the Civil War would determine whether the great experiment known as the United States of America would continue as one country or as two. The first thing I'll discuss is their backgrounds. Ulysses S. Grant was born into a working-class family in Ohio in 1822. The son of an abolitionist, growing up, he worked in his father's leather tannery. He graduated from West Point in 1843, where he finished in the lower half of his class, just like me, but excelled in military strategy and horsemanship. Following graduation, Grant gained valuable combat experience while serving in the Army during the Mexican-American War. Following the war, Grant married and started a young family, but was assigned to a series of remote outposts without them. While separated, Grant struggled with both personal and professional challenges, such as depression and alcohol, and ultimately resigned his commission in 1854 to return home to his family near St. Louis, Missouri. For years, Grant tried his hand at farming, real estate, and surveying, but wasn't particularly good at any of them. He and his family lived in relative poverty until he took a clerk's position, once again working for his father in his leather goods store. Following the cessation of several southern states and the call by President Lincoln for 75,000 volunteers in 1860, Grant rejoined the Army as the commander of an Illinois regiment. He maintained a strong belief that the only way America would survive as a single unified nation was to defeat this Southern uprising. As the Civil War started, Grant's regiment was assigned to the Western Theater near the Tennessee-Kentucky border along the Cumberland River. So now that we know a little about Grant, let's discuss Lee's background. In contrast, Robert E. Lee was born in 1807 in Virginia into a fairly prestigious family. Lee's father was a Revolutionary War hero, and two of Lee's ancestors actually signed the Declaration of Independence. Like Grant, Lee also attended West Point and graduated in 1829. But unlike Grant, and me for that matter, Lee was a model cadet and graduated at the top of his class. Following graduation, Lee served in various assignments in the Army, such as a topographical engineer and aide-de-camp, which is similar to a personal assistant, to General Winfield Scott, who was the American commander during the American-Mexican War. By war's end, many regarded Lee as one of the U.S. Army's most talented officers. Following the war, Lee continued his military service, and in response to the cessation of several southern states in 1861, he was recalled to Washington, D.C. and asked to take command of the Union Army. Lee declined, citing his loyalty to his state of Virginia, and instead resigned his commission from the U.S. Army and took command of the Confederate Army of Virginia. So as the Civil War began in 1861, Grant was in the Western Theater, while Lee was in the Eastern Theater. Next, I'd like to discuss their vision and goals. The visions and goals of Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee were shaped by their upbringing and loyalty to their respective causes. Based on his personal beliefs and as charged by President Lincoln, Grant's primary objective was to defeat the Confederate Army to ensure the survival of the United States as a unified nation. His vision was grounded in his belief that the United States government should represent all people, to include the African American population, both free and enslaved. While in the Western Theater, General Grant's military goals focused on controlling what the military calls key terrain. Sun Tzu defined key terrain as ground equally advantageous for the enemy or me. Examples of key terrain in the Western Theater included waterways, railroad intersections, road junctions, and key fortifications. These were important because they controlled the Confederate Army's ability to move and sustain itself. Meanwhile, in the Eastern Theater, Lincoln had gone through 3 different commanders of the Union Army in as many years, and recognizing Grant's many military victories, Lincoln moved him to the Eastern Theater, promoted him to be the commander of the Union Army, and charged him with the pursuit and destruction of Lee's army. At this point, Grant's military strategy shifted somewhat from key terrain to being force-focused, with the intent of destroying the Confederate Army. In contrast, Lee's vision and goals were centered around the preservation of Southern values and the independence of the Confederacy as a separate nation. Socially and economically, this included defending the institution of slavery. Lee's vision was not to conquer the North, but to defend the South from what many Southerners called Northern aggression. Lee's primary goal was the defense of the Southern states while maintaining enough combat power to sustain the war effort in order to influence public opinion in the North to seek a truce. Now let's discuss their different leadership and communication styles. One of the more significant differences between Grant and Lee was their leadership styles. Grant exhibited the characteristics of an authentic leader. This approach focuses on being genuine and real. It looks at the leader's inner qualities, such as self-awareness, self-regulation, and resilience. In this review, authentic leaders are shaped by their life experiences and values. As an authentic leader, Grant was driven by his sense of purpose and core values to maintain the Union. Grant was known for his aggressive and determined approach to warfare. A self-proclaimed simple and straightforward man, Grant's communication style reflected his personality. He preferred clear, concise, and direct language, which made his orders easier to understand and follow. So what about Lee? Lee was known for his tactical brilliance and his ability to inspire his soldiers. Lee exhibited the characteristics of a transformational leader. Transformational leaders inspire followers by connecting with their values and goals rather than simply by using their power. Ultimately, transformational leadership focuses on inspiring and motivating followers to achieve more than expected by creating a shared vision of success. It encourages leaders to act as role models and emphasizes ethical values, which Lee did both on and off the battlefield. When communicating, Lee used more formal and respectful language that was inspirational and motivational, and his letters and speeches often invoked Christian values and contained references to duty, honor, and the importance of the Southern cause. So how effective were each of them as leaders? The effectiveness of a leader is often judged by their ability to motivate and inspire their followers to achieve a common goal. Militarily, this is generally measured in terms of battles won and lost and the ultimate victor of the war. In the Western Theater, Grant experienced early successes with victories at Fort Donelson, Shiloh, Vicksburg, and Chattanooga, after which he was transferred to the Eastern Theater and promoted to commander of the Union Army to lead the Overland Campaign of 1864 against Lee's army. Historians note that although Grant's forces took significant casualties over the course of the war, he is credited with having suffered only one major defeat in the Battle of Cold Harbor in 1864. Lee's brilliant use of tactics, often against a numerically superior enemy, won him many early victories in the Eastern Theater, such as the 7 Days Battle, the Second Battle of Bull Run, Fredericksburg, and Chancellorsville. But as Confederate losses mounted in the Western Theater, Lee began initiating campaigns into northern territories with the goal of drawing large parts of the Union Army back north to protect the capital of Washington, D.C. But following his defeat at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania in 1863, Lee no longer had the men, horses, or provisions to attempt another invasion of the North, and was now compelled to fight on the defensive throughout Virginia. With the overwhelmingly disparity in resources between the Confederate and Union forces, Lee found it increasingly difficult to sustain his army, leading to his eventual surrender to Grant at the Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia on April 9, 1865. So what did each of these two men do after the war ended? After the war, Lee became a symbol of reconciliation between the North and South by focusing on rebuilding the South's devastated economy and promoting peace. In 1865, he became president of Washington College in Virginia, later renamed Washington and Lee University, where he encouraged students to embrace the future rather than dwell on the past. Lee was not punished after the Civil War, but was briefly denied the right to vote or hold office. Following a stroke, Robert E. Lee died from pneumonia in Lexington, Virginia on September 28, 1870. After the war, Grant became the 18th President of the United States and served 2 terms from 1869 to 1877. The primary focus of his presidency was on rebuilding the South and promoting civil rights for African Americans. He left office in 1877, and following several business decisions that did not work out, he once again found himself penniless, and if that wasn't bad enough, shortly thereafter was diagnosed with throat cancer. In need of money to support his family, Grant went on to write his memoirs, which became a famous account of his military career and the Civil War. Grant finished his memoirs on July 18, 1885, and passed away 5 days later. In conclusion, Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee were 2 extraordinary military leaders whose similarities and differences helped shape the outcome of the American Civil War. Both men were effective in leading their armies, but their upbringing, visions, goals, leadership approaches, communication styles, and strategies differed in many ways. Grant's vision of a united nation and his willingness to take risks ultimately led to his success, while Lee's vision of a separate Confederacy was ultimately doomed by the South's inability to match the North's industrial and numerical advantages. Nevertheless, Grant and Lee are both recognized as important leaders in American history and continue to be studied for their lessons in military strategy and effective leadership. I appreciate your time and thank you for sharing this experience with me. This concludes my presentation.